Hi everybody again. I am Courtney Kelderman and this is my final policy review. So starting off here is just a little recap of what my policy was. So my original policy, the issue that we were looking at was soil and air contamination from agriculture, specifically looking at crop agriculture. So the focus of this is looking at the fertilizers and the pollutants that those are giving off when they are released into the air. My policy is going to require a crop rotation by the farmers. So certain crops take out certain nutrients out of the soil, and by rotating which crop you use every year or every few years, it gives the soil a chance to come or recreate those fertilizers without the same crop taking out the same nutrients. And then it also requires a use of manure in place of fertilizers as much as possible. Just because manure is a more natural fertilizer versus all of the ones you can get at local elevators and everything. And then it also requires a rotation of the types of fertilizers that are used. And now an overview of what my benefit cost analysis said as well. So the benefits of this policy was the lower fertilizer cost, which was the farmers replacing their fertilizers with manure. So if they had the animals already, that's looking at saving them an average of $28,000 a year. The chemical-free air was a little harder to quantify, and that was based on people's willingness to pay for less chemicals in the air around them. And then also the organic crops was based on people's willingness to pay for organic crops versus non-organic crops. So that totaled out to be about $30,000 of benefits. And then the costs. The first cost was lowering housing values, and that was caused by the smell of manure being around the homes that are near the farms that are using this. And then locating the manure for the farmers that did not have livestock as well. And then lowering the yields and the crop rotation was going to cost. So a lot of farmers are driven by the markets and what the market is demanding, so they want to use or grow the crops that are going to have the highest yields and be worth the most at the end of the season, obviously. And by requiring a crop rotation, that could cost them, depending on what year it is and what the market's saying. And that was a total cost of $43,000. So as of right now, before any of the adjustments were made to my policy, the costs outweighed the benefits by about $13,000. So the policy evaluation assignment that we did looked at a lot, the 8 different ways to evaluate the policy, and I wanted to do a quick recap on those just because I thought that was the best way to evaluate the policies that we had been talking about. So the first was efficiency, and this one looked at, so my policy I decided was more of a decentralized policy, the way that I have it originally set up, because I didn't have an enforcement agency put in place in the original policy. So more or less the efficient policy, it's an efficient policy because the benefits are distributed pretty equally between the citizens of the community and the farmers for reducing the costs. The benefits would include things like the cleaner air for where they live, some lower costs for farmers, and what we had just gone over on the benefit cost analysis. But for the question of who gets the costs are all going to those farmers, with not equal distribution of the costs with those who are reaping the benefits as well. So Jingwen and others discussed the options of organic food, which means an added benefit to those who are around, and then this policy is not currently fully efficient. So now looking at the cost effectiveness is achieved when the maximum environment improvement is achieved with the resources that are available. There are a limited number of resources that people may use based on the policy, and there are limited nutrients in the soil. So to reach that maximum environmental improvement, something would have to change. But the nutrients in the soil also need to be reproduced, and that's going to take time, and that could also be looked at as another cost of this policy. And then, as I stated with my benefit cost analysis, the cost greatly outweighed the benefits. So this has to improve before the implementation of the policy. Now looking at the fairness and equity. So there's 2 different kinds. There's the vertical equity and the horizontal equity. Vertical looks at people that are in different wage categories, and horizontal is more looking at people within the same wage category. So I decided that this policy is more regressive than progressive because the costs are constant for each wage category. And this means in a sense that the costs could be felt harder for the lower wage categories than they will be for the higher wage categories. There was no way of like equaling out those costs to be like a proportion of these people's income. Like the costs are equal to no matter who it's affecting. So yeah, it's not equally divided between the wage categories. So the idea of environmental justice is not going to be achieved because the benefits are not greater for the poor. So essentially it's going to keep the rich rich. So now looking at the incentives for technology advancement, I didn't think that there was a lot to look at here for my policy as of right now, just because there's not a requirement for technology to get my policy started, but there could be plenty of incentives in the future to change the policy and find ways to measure the nutrients of the soil. Knowing what the nutrients are in the soil and what they need to be at and how to get them there is going to greatly benefit these farmers. So there's a huge need for a technology advancement for measuring those soils, those nutrients in the soil. So farmland is also a private good because the farmers who own the land are obviously going to be the ones who reap the benefits of the crops of the land. Therefore, the farmers are going to be the most concerned with the benefits when this policy starts. So smaller groups of people are involved in this since it's technically the farmers who are going to be dealing with the policy the most. So therefore, there may not be a huge technology push just because of the smaller number of people that are involved. But that depends also, I guess, on who cares the most once it actually would be implemented. So now looking at enforceability, the first step is that there needs to be an enforcement agency that is established. This could be something like the EPA, local governments, it could even take place at like local elevators, but it's going to require somebody that's going to have to go around, do inspections of these farms, make sure people are providing the correct information to abide by the rules and things like that. And it's going to be a lot of testing to figure out what's the most effective way to enforce this. So there's lots of costs of the enforcement that are going to be right up front. And another one is going to be like an opportunity cost, which is going to include the people that are going out and doing this checking that could be used in other ways, such as like the technology advancements. So consumers are willing to pay more for organic goods, according to Nancy Gagliardi. She also discusses like how the market is growing for organic goods. Therefore, enforceability will have more of an incentive to stick to the policy that has been created. Just because with the push for organic goods in our current markets, there's going to have to be somebody to keep enforcing this to keep that organic everything going. So now looking at the materials balance. So the law of conservation of matter discusses how there is no matter that is created or destroyed. So this looks at how the pollutants that are in the air and the soil, everything that's going into the air or the soil, like as far as fertilizers goes, that part of the pollutants, obviously none is created or destroyed, so not everything can get absorbed into the soil, so some of those pollutants are going into the air and into the soil. So reducing the emissions will mean that the nutrients will be absorbed into the soil more, or at least that's what the hope would be. Now looking at moral considerations, so manure has a lot less pollutants than what fertilizers and pesticides do, according to Hong and others. So the less pollutants, the greater the moral considerations. But the issue here is that we can't force people to be moral about the environment, but it can at least be encouraged. So people are probably going to be looking at this policy as a way of like avoiding penalties would be the biggest motivator. And people will also be less willing to abide by just their own goodwill. And then another thing is the government failures. So governments don't always have the manpower to focus on smaller policies. So considering that this policy, I think I forgot to mention that it's just in Iowa, but since it's a smaller policy and it's probably going to start in like small local communities before it grows to the whole country, there's going to be a lack of manpower to be able to enforce it. And then the market forces for goods that are being produced will be pushing farmers to be producing as much as possible as fast as possible. So farmers may choose to take the penalty or risk not getting caught with that lack of manpower instead of just abiding by the policy. And then this policy will collapse without an enforcement agency. So now looking at the next assignment we did was the evaluation of our policy type. So I changed a little bit from a decentralized policy to more of a standard setting policy, just because the standard that's being set is the amount of emissions and pollutants that these farmers are going to be allowed to emit. But it's a decentralized policy due to the lack of the enforcement agency, which could lead to like the first policy change that I'll get to a little bit later. But yeah, the standard is a specific amount that they must be required to decrease their pollutants by. Now looking at what I thought were 3 solid policy adjustments. So the first would be to set up an enforcement agency. Like I mentioned earlier, this policy will collapse without an enforcement agency. There's no going to be many farmers out there that are going to be willing to change and decrease these pollutants without being forced to do so. Like I said, that moral consideration isn't going to be there for everybody. My second policy adjustment would be like a zoning policy, and this could be like going along with the enforcement. It zones out different areas for who's going to be in jurisdiction over those areas, and also not everywhere in the country is going to have to decrease their pollutants as much, possibly. Looking at who's closer to like the big urban areas, or just who it affects more, looking at where the emissions are being the most concentrated. And then the third one being to change the amount of manure. So that would look at decreasing fertilizers even more. So this could be like a progressive thing over time, like decrease the fertilizers that can be used a little bit one year, a little bit the next year, until you get to that amount of manure requirement that you hope to be at. So yeah, those would be the policy adjustments that I would for sure look at making. And then here are my references.